Nazi generals demanded luxury. Patton gave them their worst nightmare. A convoy of swanky black Mercedes sped down a dusty track in western Germany. It was May 1945. The war in Europe was in its final, messy days. The German army was completely falling apart. But the blokes inside these spotless, gleaming cars weren't normal soldiers. They were the absolute top dogs of the Nazi regime. Top generals from the Wehrmacht and brutal commanders of the Waffen-SS. As the convoy rolled up to a heavily guarded US Army checkpoint, the cars stopped dead. An SS general hopped out of the first car. His black uniform was spotless. His boots were shined to perfection. His chest was covered in shiny medals. He didn't look like a bloke whose country had just lost. He looked exactly like someone expecting to be treated like a posh, honored guest. He strolled over to the young, grubby American lads guarding the checkpoint. Speaking in broken English, the German commander didn't put his hands up to surrender. Instead, he made a demand. He demanded to be taken to the highest-ranking American general immediately. He demanded comfy, private rooms for himself and his staff. He demanded his personal servants be allowed to stay with him. And most importantly, he demanded total protection from the advancing Soviet Red Army. The German general stood tall, fully expecting the Yanks to snap to attention, salute him, and grant his posh requests. He reckoned the Americans were soft, civilized chaps who'd happily protect a fellow officer. He thought he'd dodged the consequences of his actions. He thought he was totally safe. He was massively, catastrophically wrong. Because the American checkpoint he'd just driven into belonged to the US Third Army. And the boss of the Third Army was General George S. Patton. When Patton heard these arrogant Nazi commanders were demanding luxury and American protection, he wasn't polite. He landed a psychological blow so devastating, so utterly humiliating, it brought the supposedly fearless leaders of the master race to their knees in tears. To grasp the satisfying justice of this moment, we need to look at the terrifying reality unfolding elsewhere in Germany. To truly get the sheer panic hidden behind the smug faces of the German top brass, you have to understand what was happening in the East. For 4 long years, the German army had waged a war of total, relentless destruction against the Soviet Union. When the Nazis invaded Russia in 1941, they didn't fight a normal war. They fought a war of total wipeout. The horrific acts committed by the SS and the German army on the Eastern Front were beyond belief. They burned thousands of villages to the ground, starved millions of prisoners, and showed absolutely no mercy to anyone they conquered. But by the spring of 1945, things had completely flipped. The hunter had become the hunted. The Soviet Red Army, huge and burning with a desire for total revenge, was rapidly heading towards Berlin. And the Russians weren't bothered about taking prisoners. They didn't care about the Geneva Convention. They wanted payback. The stories of what the Soviet troops were doing as they pushed into German territory spread like wildfire. The Red Army was unstoppable. If an SS officer was caught by the Soviets, his life expectancy was mere minutes. There were no comfy prison camps waiting for them in the East. There was just a Cold War, a firing squad, or a long, horrible trip to the freezing labor camps of Siberia. The top German generals, the SS commanders, and the Nazi politicians knew exactly what they'd done, and they knew that if Joseph Stalin's men caught them, they'd face the ultimate, brutal consequences. The fearless, fanatical leaders of the Third Reich, the men who had projected strength and terror for over a decade, were suddenly paralyzed by an overwhelming, suffocating fear. They realized they had to escape, but they had nowhere to go. The oceans were blocked. The skies were controlled by Allied planes. They had only one desperate option left. They had to run west. They had to surrender to the Americans. What happened next was one of the most pathetic and cowardly migrations in military history. As Soviet artillery began raining down on the eastern German cities, the brave leaders of the Nazi elite decided to completely abandon their posts. Generals who had spent years ordering young teenage German boys to fight to the last bullet, generals who threatened to hang any regular soldier who retreated a single inch, suddenly decided that their own lives were too valuable to risk. They packed their tailored uniforms, their stolen artwork, their expensive champagne, and their personal servants into luxury staffed cars. They abandoned their starving, desperate infantrymen to face the wrath of the Red Army alone, while they sped westward as fast as their vehicles could carry them. Their entire survival strategy relied on a massive, fundamental misunderstanding of the American mindset. Decades of Nazi propaganda had taught these officers that the Americans were a weak, soft, and overly civilized nation of merchants. The German elite believed that the Americans lacked the harsh, ruthless edge needed for total war. More importantly, the German generals believed in the old aristocratic rules of European warfare. They firmly believed that rank transcended nations. They thought that an American general and a German general were part of the same exclusive gentlemanly club. They assumed that once they crossed the American lines, they would simply hand over their pistols, shake hands, and be treated as honored guests. They believed the Americans would be so impressed by their high military rank that they would immediately grant them VIP status, feed them fine meals, and protect them from the savage Soviet forces. They were expecting a luxurious, comfortable captivity. With this staggering delusion in their minds, convoys of highly decorated German officers drove toward the American lines, desperate to find safety behind the stars and stripes. When these convoys arrived at the American checkpoints, the scene was almost entirely surreal. The American infantrymen manning the roadblocks were exhausted. They had fought through the freezing snows of the Ardennes. They were covered in mud, surviving on cold, canned food, and mourning the friends they had lost just days prior. Suddenly, polished Mercedes-Benz vehicles pulled up, and out stepped men who looked like they were attending a military parade. The German officers did not act like defeated men. They acted annoyed. They barked orders in German, demanding that the American privates fetch their commanding officers immediately. They demanded that their luggage be handled carefully. They requested separate quarters from the regular enlisted soldiers, whom they considered beneath their dignity. Some of these arrogant generals even attempted to play political games. They tried to tell the American officers that Germany and America should immediately team up. They argued that the real enemy was the Soviet Union, and that the Americans needed the brilliant minds of the German high command to fight the communists. They expected the Americans to nod in agreement and welcome them into the command tents. But the American GIS just stared at them in absolute, stunned silence. The sheer audacity, the unbelievable arrogance of these men, who had just plunged the entire world into a global catastrophe, was infuriating. The young American soldiers did not salute. They did not carry their bags. They simply pointed their M1 Garand rifles at the luxury cars and told the master race to shut their mouths and get out of the vehicles. Word of these arrogant, demanding prisoners quickly traveled up the chain of command. News reached the man in command of the United States Third Army rather quickly. General George S. Patton. Patton understood war's stage and mind. He knew how to boost his men, and crucially, how to crush his enemy's morale. Patton had recently seen the liberated concentration camps. He'd witnessed the horrific, ultimate outcomes of Nazi ideology. His tolerance for German military leaders, especially the SS, was gone. When Patton heard that fleeing Nazi generals wanted luxuries, separate rooms, and safety from the Russians, his response was cold and planned. He didn't order them hurt. He knew a much better, more painful way to defeat them. He chose to take away their very identities. Patton drove to where the high-ranking German officers were held. The German generals, seeing a famous American commander approach with his polished helmet and ivory-handled revolvers, snapped to attention. They saluted smartly, expecting Patton to return the gesture and treat them as equals. Patton didn't salute. He ignored their ranks. He walked down the line of captured officers, pure disgust in his eyes. The German commanding officer stepped forward. He started to speak, listing his demands. He mentioned his rank, his service years, and his expectation of honorable treatment under international war laws. He specifically requested that he and his officers be kept far from ordinary prisoners and completely separate from any approaching Soviet troops. Patton stopped. He looked the German general straight in the eye. The silence was intense and deeply awkward. When Patton finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it had a sharp, cutting edge. He told the German generals they weren't honorable soldiers. He said they were the creators of a cowardly, criminal regime. Patton immediately ordered his military police forward. He gave a series of quick, crushing commands. Take their medals, Patton ordered. Take their insignia. Strip them of their rank. The German officers gasped as American GIS roughly ripped the iron crosses and silver collar tabs from their crisp uniforms. For a career military officer, losing rank insignia is the ultimate professional humiliation. It reduces them to nothing. But Patton was just starting. Take their luggage, he continued, confiscate their vehicles, and send their servants to the standard labor camps. The German generals protested frantically. They argued it violated their rights as officers. They demanded the privileges of their high status. Patton just stared, unfazed by their anger. He pointed to a large, muddy, open-air enclosure packed with thousands of ordinary, dirty, starving German soldiers. You will march into that mud with the rest of your men, Patton told them. You will eat the same rations. You will sleep in the same dirt. You have no rank here. You are nothing but defeated prisoners of the United States Army. The fantasy of comfortable, high-class captivity vanished instantly. The arrogant German officers realized they wouldn't be treated as guests. They would be treated as the criminals they were. But one high-ranking SS commander, unable to control his massive ego, made a critical error. He stepped out of line, his face red with rage. He looked directly at General Patton and raised his voice. He claimed American treatment was barbaric. He insisted Americans were legally bound to provide officer-level facilities. And then he played his final card. He demanded, once more, that Americans guarantee their absolute protection, stating that if not treated with respect, they would rather take their chances elsewhere. Patton slowly turned his head. He stepped so close to the SS commander that the German had to lean back. Patton didn't yell. He didn't draw his weapon. He delivered a psychological blow far more terrifying than a bullet. You listen to me, you arrogant son of a bitch, Patton said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. You're alive right now because I allow it. Patton leaned in closer, his eyes fixed on the panicked face of the Nazi commander. If I hear one more word of complaint, Patton whispered coldly, if you demand one more luxury, or if you ever try to quote the rules of war to me again, I'll have my men load every single one of you onto open cargo trucks. Patton paused, letting the silence hang for a terrible second. And I will personally drive those trucks east and hand you over directly to the Soviet Red Army. Do we understand each other? The impact of those words was immediate and devastating. All color drained from the SS commander's face. His whole body became rigid. The sheer, overwhelming terror of the Red Army. The very thing he'd abandoned his troops and fled across the country to escape, suddenly stared him in the face. He knew exactly what the Russians would do to him. He knew Patton was ruthless enough to make that threat a reality. The German commander's legs began to shake. His arrogant posture collapsed. He lowered his head, unable to meet the American general's eyes. Yes, General, the broken Nazi whispered, his voice trembling. The threat of being handed over to Joseph Stalin's forces was the ultimate psychological weapon. It instantly destroyed any remaining pride the German high command possessed. Without another word, the once arrogant, demanding generals quietly turned, stripped of their medals, cars, and dignity. They marched silently into the muddy, overcrowded prisoner pens, just as Patton had ordered. There were no more requests for champagne, no more demands for private rooms, and absolutely no more talk of the master race. General George S. Patton is mostly remembered for his brilliant armored strategies, aggressive tank pushes, and relentless drive across Europe. But his handling of the fleeing Nazi elite is a masterclass in psychological warfare. Patton understood the Third Reich's leaders were narcissists who thrived on hierarchy, respect, and fear. Physical punishment would have made them feel like martyrs. But treating them like ordinary, insignificant criminals and threatening them with their worst nightmare broke them in a way physical force never could. The German generals had spent years acting like untouchable gods, ordering millions of deaths without a second thought. But faced with the harsh reality of their defeat, they proved to be nothing more than terrified cowards, desperately fleeing the consequences of their actions. Patton didn't grant them the honor of a gentleman's surrender. He refused to let them escape the war with their egos intact. He stripped them of their aristocratic illusions, forced them into the mud with the men they'd abandoned, and reminded them they were completely at his mercy. It was brilliant, bloodless, and deeply satisfying battlefield justice. It proved that sometimes a commander's most devastating weapon is simply knowing their enemy's greatest fear. What do you think of General Patton's brutal psychological threat? Was stripping the German generals of their rank and threatening them with the Red Army the perfect way to break their arrogance? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you appreciate raw, authentic, untold World War II history, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel.